All right, y'all. I'm so sorry to be missing class today, but I wanted to make sure that you still had access to our learning materials so that you didn't fall far behind and you still are ready to go to finish this unit up next Monday. So quickly, I want you to take 2 to 3 minutes, read the excerpt on French colonization that is at the top of your handout on the Do Now. It looks like that, and use it to compare French patterns with both Spanish and the British. So, Mr. Sub, please, or Miss Sub, whoever's subbing, can you pause the video and set the timer for 2 to 3 minutes? Start with two. If you need three, that's okay. And then you guys can share with your partner about the ways French colonization is similar and different from the Spanish and the British. Read. All right, welcome back. It's important to note that French colonization patterns are unique to the French in that they send far fewer settlers. They establish positive trade relations with the Native Americans, largely based on the fur trade. And that's really important for what comes next in that the Native Americans much prefer the French presence to the British or the Spanish for a couple reasons. Reason one, it's fewer people. Reason two, it's not permanent settlement, so it's less likely to lead to warfare. Reason three, the French aren't demanding a lot of land. And reason four, because there's not as many people, there's less spread of disease. But I think this data is quite helpful. And that we see in terms of like the population changes over time. I think it's really helpful to think about this data in a meaningful way to look at like the Spanish have this massive, massive, massive head start on colonization, but it's alarming how quickly the British colonies catch up just in terms of like how many people are in the British colonies in the New World. And even despite some growth in the French Empire, it is noteworthy how small that empire still is, population-wise, compared to the Spanish or the British, which is why the natives much prefer the French presence to the others. So that's just a good way to bring in the French and review some of the Spanish and British differences in the first place. Today, we're talking about colonial economic and political development. On Monday in class, we'll talk about the Enlightenment and the First Great Awakening. And then we are done with this first unit. So congratulations, you're almost done with one whole unit of APUSH. So as we get started, make sure you follow along on your handout. I'll be clear about where we should be at what point. But it's important to note that unlike the Spanish colonies, who are royal colonies, they are dictated their actions by the crown of Spain. For the most part, the English government's going to leave the colonies alone. Right? They're going to engage in this policy that's on your handout called salutary neglect. Right? Neglect is to be ignored or to be left alone. Salutary means like by policy. So the policy the British are going to embrace is a policy of, look, those guys are over there. They're across the ocean. They're doing their own thing. We're going to let them self-govern. We're going to let them kind of rule themselves. We're going to let them do what they want with slavery, do what they want with class structures, do what they want with social developments. We're going to leave them alone because the colonies are not state funded. They're not paid for by the British government, and therefore they're not protected by the British government, right? When they have a war with the Indians, it's their own war, right? It's not the British Army and Navy that's coming to fight it. So they're not protected by the state. They're not funded by the state. This is a policy of salutary neglect. But that's going to change slightly in the mid 1600s. And it's only going to change economically. The colonies are going to largely be left alone politically, left alone socially. But King Charles II is going to look at these colonies and be like, you know what? We could be making more money from them, right? And these colonies should exist to make us as the mother country richer, right? They're going to realize that the colonies are kind of trading with whoever they want. But if they just traded with the British would get richer. So Charles II is going to initiate an intervention, a policy, a regulation that's called mercantilism. And mercantilism is a simple economic system that says colonies exist to make the mother country rich. And therefore, colonies should only be allowed to trade with their mother country and buy goods back from their mother country. So colonial tobacco should go to England. Colonial rice should go to England. Colonial ships should go to England. Colonial timber, anything the colonists are making should go to England. And when the colonies want back manufactured goods or finished products or anything, they should buy it from England. And this policy of mercantilism is going to be enforced by a law, a series of laws called the Navigation Acts. So it's important you recognize this relationship. Mercantilism is the theory. The Navigation Acts is the actual policy that enforces that theory. The Navigation Acts of 1660 and 1663 make a policy that says that goods can only be sold to and through British ports and on British-made ships. So it's got to come on a British boat and it's got to go to the British Empire. That's the only way the colonies can engage in commerce, can engage in trade. All right, so any enumerated good, if the word is used, that's like a raw material, tobacco, sugar, lumber, fish, indigo, rice, tar, any raw material has to go to and through England, and they have to be shipped to Britain on British ships. Now, what this does do, partially, is allow the colonists to engage in shipbuilding because they're British colonies. So if they build ships, they are generally speaking British ships. And it is going to provide some markets for colonial goods. But it's important to recognize this is the first real restriction on what the colonists do in their colonial life. So take a quick minute. Please set the timer for 2 to 3 minutes. Again, start with two, go to three if you need it. To please read this short little chunk on the Navigation Acts. It looks like this. And tell me, in what ways might these laws benefit both the British and their colonies? And in what ways do these rules undermine colonial interests? In other words, why would these be potentially bad for the colonists? Cool. Take 2 to 3 minutes, read it on your own, discuss with your partner, and come back together after that time. Welcome back. Glad you are here. Hopefully, we're cooking right along. So it's important to recognize that mercantilism does benefit the British because it allows them to control trade and maximize their profits. It also helps the colonists because it means they have a consistent market for their goods and a consistent place from which they can buy materials. That kind of helps their economy develop. But it is detrimental to the colonists in that it removes the colonists' ability to sell to other places, which could give them more profit, and it keeps the colonies from industrializing, from modernizing their economy, because they keep having to buy manufactured goods from England. Now, again, as the text states at the very end, it's important to note that for the most part, the colonies say, cool, don't care, we're going to trade with who we want to anyway. We're going to smuggle, engage in smuggling, as it is called, because this law is really, really difficult to enforce. So, because of mercantilism, this is kind of the system that gets built economically within the colonies, within Europe, and within Africa. Now, this is called the Atlantic System of Exchange. The Atlantic System of Exchange. It's also commonly called the Triangle Trade. I prefer the Atlantic System of Exchange because it's important that we'll note in class on Monday that it's not just goods that are being exchanged. It's not just trade, but we're also exchanging ideas, people, movements like the Enlightenment, like the First Great Awakening, that will kind of come with the goods to places in the colony. So as we can see, the colonies are going to provide raw materials to England and to Africa, things like fish and tobacco and rice, right? And as you can see, everything coming back this direction, right to left, is manufactured goods, is raw materials. So we see one impact of the Navigation Acts is the availability of manufactured goods is a place to sell markets and goods. We also see this also increasing the slave trade dramatically. So I have a couple questions for you on the handout. If you could respond to those for me. We see this growing impact of ports and growing cities. Places like New York and Philadelphia are going to thrive because of mercantilism, because that's where all the goods will be shipped to and from. But I have a question on colonial cities on the handout. I have three questions on commerce and trade on the handout. So I'm going to have you take 4 minutes to answer these four questions. Set the timer for 4 minutes. And then after four, I'll give you the right answers and we'll see how we did. 4 minutes, and then take 1 minute to share your answers with your partner, and then we'll come back together and check our answers. Cool. Get to it. Excellent. The first question on colonial cities, the answer is going to be A. Excellent. This question down below on the value of selected goods to and from British North America is going to be D. Extensive trade networks provide goods. The second question here is going to be A. Disagreement over the enforcement of mercantilistic restrictions like the Navigation Acts. Right? Colonists aren't going to like the fact that they're being restricted here. So they're going to kind of just smuggle anyway. And the last question down on the bottom right, the answer is C. We see dramatic increase in demand for British goods because they are available and the colonists like to buy British stuff and feel fancy and British. Excellent. Good work. Good work. Good work. Take a quick minute. I need you to read this. Now we're going to pivot away from mercantilism and the economy and talk about politics and self-government. Go ahead and read the short little chunk that starts with distance and Britain's initially lax attention, and then respond to my question. What were the effects of Britain's imperial policy on the development of colonial political institutions? In other words, the British are leaving the colonists alone to self-govern. what are some of the effects of that on institutions, on ways in which the colonists are going to govern themselves? Take 2 minutes to read and respond, a minute to talk about with your partner, and then come back together. Set the timer for 3, 2 to read, 1 to talk. Jump in. All right, hey, welcome back. What's going on? Let's talk about salutary neglect and self-government. This is one way in which the colonies are going to be left alone and develop their own unique identity. We've already talked about this to an extent with things like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, town assemblies in Massachusetts. Now we can kind of all put it together and really talk about the ways in which the colonies as a whole are going to self-govern. Now, each of the three colonial regions, New England, the Middle Colonies, and the South, are all going to govern themselves, self-government, salutary neglect. Now, the ways in which they will govern themselves will look different based off of region and who is seen in each region as a powerful entity that has the right to govern. Now, in New England, we're going to have those town assemblies we talked about in class last week, or on Monday, excuse me. Each town has their own assembly. It's a very, very direct form of democracy. They'll all come together. They'll all vote on every single issue. But it's important that in these New England town meetings, town assemblies, voting rights are largely limited to male church members, male church members. There is one exception. For a short time, the King of England tries to like put more control on the New England colonists with what's called the Dominion of New England, tries to govern all the Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut, tries to govern them as one entity called the Dominion of New England. It goes badly. The King James sends a royal governor to kind of run them all together. These colonists do much like Bacon's Rebellion does and burns things to the ground. King James says, never mind, my bad, never mind, my bad. You're right. You guys can govern yourselves. We'll leave you alone. But that teaches a lesson that when the colonists get mad, they get what they want. Does not go well. In the middle colonies, the assemblies are going to largely reflect the basic democratic principles and the rights of Englishmen that we see in things like the English Constitution, with assemblies, representative governments. It's not a direct democracy. They're going to vote for representatives that will go and make policies on their behalf. In the middle colonies, because in the middle colonies, they're much more based on commerce and trade, it is the merchant class, the business people, the ones who are engaging in commerce and trade, who are going to dominate these assemblies. And in the southern colonies, we're going to see things like the House of Burgesses in Virginia, a similar assembly in North Carolina, in South Carolina, and in Georgia, in which in all these southern colonies, it is the wealthy planter elites that have the power in these representative assemblies. So it's important to note that all three regions have self-government, but all three regions are going to differ based off who has the power, based off of who is seen as authoritative in each region, based off of their regional characteristics. So the thing that I'll share is this development of colonial democracy, political self-rule, which allows the government of each of these colonies to kind of establish their own identity. Now, from a society standpoint, right, so we hit economics, we hit politics, we'll hit some of the social developments here as well rapidly before I let you jump into a colonial review chart comparing all the different regions. Now, in New England, it is the church members that have social power, different than economic or political power, but like a social class, social status. It is the church members and landowners that dominate New England society. In the middle colonies, it is the wealthy merchant class and the smaller farmer class, because it's a much more diverse population in the middle colonies. The middle colonies are more fluid social class-wise, meaning it's the one place where you can kind of like start poor and work your way up because of the fluidity of like business and commerce and trade. In the southern colonies, as you guys know, society is dominated by the planter class, the planter elites. And one of the reasons for that is that slavery is much more prevalent, much more dominant as a institution that allows the planter class to kind of keep their hands clean and do what they want and still get rich. Now, in Southern society, thanks to things like Bacon's Rebellion, we see a very rigid social structure. The planter class is at the top, the yeoman farmer class is below, landspeople below, and slaves at the bottom. It's a very rigid, socially stratified society. But overall, in the colonies as a whole, people that have land or businesses have the most influence and authority. It's also important to note that as time develops, our class lines in the colonies get a little bit more rigid. At the beginning, when things are kind of a free-for-all, there's much more opportunity for somebody to kind of start fresh and work their way up. But by the 1700s into the 1750s and 60s, we see more concentration of wealth and therefore more rigid class-based society. All right. You guys saw this picture on the left in class just yesterday. On the right, you see kind of the New England's version where the yeoman farmers make up the biggest chunk. It's kind of like small farmers that kind of farm for themselves. Up above them are like professionals and artisans, small businesses, and above them are merchants and lawyers and doctors and the like, right? And you can see at the very bottom, There's a small chunk of slaves in New England. They still exist. It's not a slave society, but it's a society with slaves. Um, and much different than the Southern society, which is a slave dominant social class. Now, religiously speaking, we're also going to see diversity based off of region of origin. It's important to recognize this goes back to things like the puritanical Great Migration, the Heterite system. All these things are going to plant seeds that develop religious roots that vary by region. Where in New England, we see the dominant Puritan, Congregationalist, religious conformity world. That shouldn't surprise us based off of what we know about things like the city on a hill, Roger Williams and Hutchinson being kicked out to Rhode Island because of their beliefs. And as you can see here in this map, it is the Congregational Church, right, or the Puritan Church that is the dominant religion of New England. As we know from class on Monday, the Middle Colonies have a massive diversity of religion. We see this cool quote from a visitor to Pennsylvania that says there's Lutherans and Reformed and Catholics and Quakers and Mennonists and Anabaptists and herd hunters. I don't know what that is. Moravians, Brethren, Pietists, Seventh-day Baptists, Dunkers, little basketball players hooping out in Pennsylvania, Presbyterians, Jews, Mohammedans, which is Muslims, and pagans. People don't even believe in God, right? And because of that diversity, we also see, and you can see in this Pennsylvania map, all these different kinds of churches that are prevalent in Pennsylvania. It's the one place where you see, oh my God, it's so diverse. Religious toleration. Whereas in the southern colonies, for a couple reasons, one reason being like their close economic ties with England, thanks to tobacco and cash crops, we see the southern colonies are being dominated by the Anglican Church. As a reminder, that is the official church of England. So that shouldn't surprise us at all, right? We see these guys came for economic reasons, so they kept their religious ties to England. These guys came for religious reasons, so they severed their religious ties to England. Again, these roots shouldn't be surprising us based off of what the fruit that they are bearing. Now, it's important to recognize that we're not just going to see differences based off of north, middle, south. We're also going to see an east versus west divide. I can go back to my map here and show you what I mean, right? The Atlantic seaboard, the farthest east portions of the colonies, are the places that are going to be settled first and have the most prosperity, most riches, most success. Whereas the people on the west are moving inland. What is this called? Go back to class yesterday. It's an F word. Say it loud. Not that F word. The frontier. Right? We're going to see divide on east-west lines throughout the colonies from the Atlantic seaboard and the frontier moving inland. It is usually, regardless of which colony it is the eastern elites that are closer to the Atlantic seaboard, closer to the ocean, that are going to dominate colonial and state legislatures and economies, right? It's the Puritans in New England that settle along the coast. They have the power. It is the Quakers in Pennsylvania. It is the Anglicans in Virginia. The planter class, that's where the power is. And in all three regions, whether it be New England, the middle colonies, or the South, we're going to see the western frontier having conflict with the elites on the Atlantic seaboard. Usually these people are more self-sufficient, self-reliant. They feel unrepresented by their governments that are in more established areas. They're more frequently in contact with natives, and they're more likely to be non-British, right? The Scots-Irish are going to settle on the frontier. The Germans are going to settle on the frontier, and that's going to create like some ethnic divide as well. So usually it's like Eastern Atlantic seaboard British people that are getting richer, and other more recent immigrants like the Scots-Irish or the Germans that are going to be on the frontier having more conflict. So this causes this east-west divide that we see in things like Bacon's Rebellion, just like class yesterday. It's an example of class divide between the colonial planter elites in Virginia and Bacon and his former indentured servants, black colonists, lower class rebels. We see a similar conflict in Pennsylvania called the Paxton Boys. That's helpful SFI, specific factual information, that just like Bacon's Rebellion is initiated by a native tribe, but it demonstrates that these backcountry frontier settlers are mad, they're angry, they're frustrated because the legislature, the assembly in Pennsylvania, is not responding to their needs on the frontier, and much like Bacon's Rebellion, is being too passive, too peaceful, too accommodating, too friendly to the Native Americans. This armed group, much like Bacon's Rebellion, I told you, we do this 500 times, we get mad, we burn things down. This armed group marches towards Philadelphia, eventually gets appeased or they're compromised with the delegation. And then the regulator movement in North Carolina follows a similar pattern. What do you know? It's backcountry frontier farmers that want more representation, that want more power, that want a voice in their colonial government, that they see as corrupt and only serving the planter elites. So all three of these rebellions, we spent great time yesterday with Bacon's. All three of these help us understand the growing divide in the colonies between who is seen as the elites that have consolidated power over self-government institutions, like the House of Burgesses, and the frontier farmers who feel unrepresented in society as their only recourse they feel is to burn things down and make a mess. Cool. Much like Bacon's Rebellion, this regulator movement in North Carolina is ultimately defeated by a colonial militia. So this is a good examples of class conflict in the colonies. As the colonies are becoming more successful, that's good news. We're starting to see class divide as well, that in some ways mirrors what's happening elsewhere in the world. Now, the last couple of things you have to do today, you should be pretty good, dialed in, ready to go for. I have a short read that kind of sums up all these things about mercantilism and immigration and cultural diversity. It kind of puts in place the things you just read. I'm going to give about 6 or so minutes to read that. It does a good job of kind of putting things in place. We've been learning about a whole bunch of content. It helps kind of compartmentalize and see where things should be. And then I have for you a good looking chart. It looks familiar. It looks like the chart I gave you a couple days ago, but here it is again. Therefore, it might be useful. And you and your partner are going to work together to work to unpack this short answer style question, which will look a lot like what you'll see in your test next week. Right? I got some differences in the economy, some similarities in the economy, and a reason for the differences. This is a cool little opportunity to use this resource that's in front of you, this table, and each other to just bullet point out responses that would answer A, B, and C. And then to end class today, I have a nice colonial regional chart for you to fill out. This is a good place to put everything we've learned. Politically, economically, socially, who settles, what happens, put SFI in there, put tobacco in the South, put Puritans in New England, the middle colonies, put that they grew bread baskets. Just kidding, you know for a fact they didn't grow bread baskets. They're called the breadbasket colonies. Make sure you don't get that mixed up. But here you can put in place every piece of information that we've been learning so far fits into this box somewhere. Put it there. Have a great day. Do your homework this weekend. We got the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening on Monday, and then we are done with period 1 and 2 together. We test next Thursday. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or send me a remind message. And most of all, I appreciate you and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Love you guys.